Okay, so once again, I'm cracking on my video response to John Lennox and to his hour-and-a-half opus. I think it's a bit of a collation of different things that he's made, this video, but his video answering new atheist objections, and really, to use a kind of religious metaphor, this video of his, it's kind of like a YouTube atheist's manna from heaven. It's the kind of video that I would, if I was to sponsor John Lennox, if I was to go to John Lennox and say, look, John, I am going to pay you to make a video on my behalf, and what I want you to do is to compile all the half-arsed, half-baked Christian apologetic, weak as dishwater arguments all together, one after another, so that I can respond to them. I think this is the kind of form that it would take. And it's really sad, actually, that this is about the best that there is to offer from Christian apologetics in the main. Okay, so I tell you what, that's my opinion of it, but that doesn't really count for shit, does it? Let's get on with his next argument, and then I'll make my responses to it. Fuck, that was John Lennon. Sorry, try again. John Lennox.
Can one see evidence of a creator in nature? I believe that one can. Nature is not neutral. It's not, as Stephen Jay Gould, the famous paleontologist, put it, that whatever we think of God, there's no evidence of him in nature. I think there very much is. But I would start actually with the fact that one of the biblical claims is that the heavens declare the glory of God and the earth shows his handiwork.
Well, shit, I don't know about you, but that's me convinced. Look what John Lennox does in this particular argument. Remember, he's trying to argue that there's evidence of God, for God in nature. And what he does first off, as you will see after a slightly ropey and somewhat extraordinary appeal to authority, is that effectively he makes two separate arguments, but he doesn't flag it up as two separate arguments. He just kind of meanders from one to another and back again. But to just isolate those two arguments, and you'll see them as they come up, is that the first argument that he makes is that effectively the universe is of a kind which is comprehensible, and therefore science can work, therefore God. And the second argument, a very separate argument, is that we have the ability to comprehend the universe in which we live, therefore God. Okay, so I'll tell you what I'll do. Let him get on with these, and we'll start with the ropey appeal to authority.
I always remember, because I studied in Cambridge, that the brilliant scientist James Clerk Maxwell, who gave us electromagnetic theory, had inscribed over the door of the Cavendish laboratory, where many of the epoch-making experiments in physics were done, "Great are the works of the Lord, sought out by those, or studied by those who take delight in them." That James Clerk Maxwell, along with many of the great pioneers of science, indeed practically all of the early ones like Galileo and Kepler and Newton, they saw evidence of God in nature, and in fact they devoted their science to explicating that evidence.
So I really didn't know what John Lennox expected me to take away from that. If I'm somehow supposed to be impressed by that, it's as if he's told me that, I don't know, there was some ancient Greek guy who started studying lightning production, and that he felt that what he was studying was the mechanisms that Zeus used to produce his thunderbolts. And as if I'm supposed to sort of say as a result of that, oh, well, maybe that does show that lightning evidences the existence of Zeus. No, all it actually evidences is the prejudices of the person that is doing the research. And the same thing here, what you were talking about is a whole slew of scientists over centuries where people were very, very, very religious and had a very, very strong religious pre-commitment, who obviously and absolutely understandably went into their field of study with an understanding, with a personal belief that God had created the universe. So of course they believed that they were studying God's creation. It's very much like the biblical archaeologist William F. Albright, who went into the field of archaeology. Biblical archaeology is what he called it, so he very much hung his hook there, his prejudices for us all to see, and he went out there effectively to try and confirm the genesis account. Does the fact that William F. Albright went out there to try and confirm the Genesis account in any way evidence to us that the Genesis account is true? No, it doesn't at all. We can only go on the results that he had, and given the results that we've had since and the criticisms that we've had of his work since, including by people who were scholars who he trained up himself, we know that that Genesis account, of course, is not true. It's all myth, it's all fable, it's all legend. So I really don't know what John Lennox expected me to take away from that.
So my first response to it is this, that the Christian cradle gave birth to modern science in the sense that the contemporary scientific set of investigations arose because of the conviction that there is a designer, there is an intelligence, there is a God who created and upheld nature. That set people free and encouraged them actually to do science.
So his claim seems to be now he's developing it that somehow that a belief in a designer is what gives people the motive force to do science, despite the history around the world where in most times and most places, if anything, religion has suppressed people's desire to investigate the world. And in Christianity has gone out of its way at times to suppress people's ability to do science. And yet what he's saying is that it is the belief in a designer that provides that motive force. So presumably what he's saying, the corollary to that, is that if you do not have the belief in a designer, you would not have the motive force to do science. You wouldn't be interested in the world around you, or you wouldn't believe that the world around you is of the form that could be investigated. You'd think, well, I'll drop this metal ball and maybe it will fall at a constant acceleration, but then if I drop the metal ball again, it'll probably just turn into a pineapple, sprout wings and fly away. Why would you think that? Why would you think that the components that are required to do science would not exist if there is no designer? And why would you not have the desire to know the world around you if you don't believe in a designer? I mean, it flies so far in the face of what we know about scientists and their beliefs as it just beggars belief. It was a study that was published in the esteemed journal Nature in, I think it was 1998, which showed it at the time in the National Academy of Sciences in the United States, which is the very top tier of scientists in the United States, that 93% of them professed to either being an atheist or an agnostic, so that 93% of them were happily motivated to go out there and to try and understand the universe, despite not regarding that universe as having been constructed by a designer. So I'm just baffled as to what point John Lennox is trying to make there. It certainly isn't working for me, John.
And one of the greatest evidences to me that that is the case is the fact that we can do science at all, that we can do mathematics, and we find the mathematics that we do in our heads in here corresponds to what we find in the universe out there.
So this is the first of these two arguments that I've said that he makes effectively without differentiating between the two. But this argument amounts to the sort of line that the universe is of a kind which is comprehensible, therefore God. And this is an argument that I've heard time and time again, and I've never really got my head round this. And I've kind of given this argument the label in the past of the argument from cake and eat it, because it's very much an argument that seems to want it both ways. That if you can't explain something, then God did it, right? If the universe is so mysterious and so incomprehensible that we just can't explain things, then that is evidence for God. But if you can explain something, then God must have done it as well, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to explain it. So I've just got to ask then, right, and this is a question I've asked time and time and time and time again on videos such as this, to people like John Lennox or people who agree with John Lennox, just explain to me, just furnish me with the kind of universe that you could have that would not evidence God. Talk about a universe where science wouldn't work. Describe it to me. Tell me what it would look like, a universe where science wouldn't work, and tell me why science, what the things would be in that universe that would be happening that would stop science working, and why we wouldn't be saying, why are these fucking things happening? Right? Why when I do, because all that science really requires, it seems to me, is repeatability. That if you do A, you get B. And if you do A again, you get B. Again, that is all that happens. And in those situations where we do A and we get B, and then we do A again and we don't get B, our first port of call is to say something must be invoking into this situation to stop the same thing happening. In other words, we see the same thing happening as the default. We see that as the mundane. We see that as the thing that does not require an explanation, do we not? And yet apparently this one thing that we require for science to work is evidence for God. So just tell me what wouldn't be evidence for God, because it very much seems that it's cake and eat it. Whatever scenario we have, that is being pointed to and saying, yep, that's evidence for God.
Well, atheism, which is one worldview that's very dominant in the academy today, tells us that the human mind is simply the accidental byproduct of a mindless, purposeless process. Well, one begins to wonder how such an apparatus could begin to deliver any kind of truth at all.
So he hasn't flagged it up, but effectively he's drifted on to the second of the two arguments that I told you that he would make, which is this idea that we have the ability to comprehend the universe, therefore God. And the short answer to his question is because it has benefit. Surely even John Lennox can see this, that it doesn't matter whether you are a human or a human's pet cat, that having an accurate perception of the world is going to have evolutionary benefit. Now that isn't the whole answer there, and we're getting on it was when I heard him say this, I thought we're getting dangerously close to kind of Alvin Plantinga territory here in the evolutionary argument against naturalism, and lo and behold he mentions Plantinga's name in the very next line. So back to John Lennox.
And indeed many noted philosophers like Alvin Plantinga are bearing down on this, that this atheistic explanation of the universe undermines the very rationality which all scientists must believe in to do their science.
Okay, so this is going to be the last bit that I'm going to tackle here. And this effectively forms the meat and potatoes of this video. So what John Lennox is saying here is that effectively what he's saying is not an argument against atheism, it's an argument against evolutionary biology. And what he's saying is, effectively, although he doesn't say it, and he probably maybe doesn't even realize it, is that he's saying that if our cognitive faculties as a result of evolutionary biology, that we do not have sufficient warrant to believe that they are reliable. And this is the point that Alvin Plantinga makes in his argument, the evolutionary argument against naturalism, which I've read. And this is not the original version of Plantinga. This is a later edition, a more refined version of his. It's an interesting argument, but right from the start, John Lennox is bastardizing and misportraying Alvin Plantinga, because what John Lennox is saying is that the evolutionary process cannot give you accurate cognitive faculties that truthfully represent nature. That is not what Alvin Plantinga says. What Alvin Plantinga says in his argument is that we do not have sufficient warrant to discern between an evolutionary process that gives us accurate cognitive faculties and an evolutionary process that does not. In other words, what Plantinga is saying is that there's more than one solution, right? That evolution acts on outputs. And as long as the outputs are right, then it doesn't really matter whether the process is right. But in terms of understanding the universe and appreciating it as we would like to, then the process is as important as well. So Plantinga isn't saying that evolution cannot select for truth value. He's saying that it won't necessarily select for truth value. That's different to what John Lennox is saying. John Lennox is casting aspersions on evolution totally and saying he doesn't see how it can select for truth value at all. He then quotes Plantinga, but Plantinga never said that. Now, I need to try to show you the objections that I have for Plantinga and how that links back to John Lennox and throws it back in his face, I need to just try and describe to you what Alvin Plantinga is saying briefly. And what he's trying to put across what Plantinga is saying is that effectively, whilst truth clearly confers an evolutionary advantage, it doesn't necessarily require truth. That you could be labouring under a misapprehension and still end up with the right output, and so evolution can still select for it. So one of the examples that he gave and he refined over the years was this example of being chased by a tiger. So we understand that if I'm being chased by a tiger, there are two facts here that are relevant. One is that I do not wish to be eaten by the tiger, and the second is that the tiger is going to eat me. And so as a result of that, evolution has led me to run away from the tiger. But Plantinga suggests, well, what about this? What about if we erroneously believed that the tiger wanted to give us a cuddle rather than eat us, and that we really didn't want to be cuddled by a tiger? What would happen? We would do the same thing. We would still run away. So evolution would still select for that in the same kind of way, even though it results from a misunderstanding of the world around us, which is the nature of how a tiger is going to interact with us given a chance. Now, you can probably immediately see the first objection that one might have to this was that it requires a suffocatingly close system for it to work. It's so easy to be falsified. And that if we had these misapprehensions about the world around us, we would probably be aware of them. So, for example, the example of a tiger, all it takes is for one person to slip whilst running away from the tiger at any point in history and to be observed as slipping and eaten by a tiger, and everybody else immediately realizes that actually tigers do not wish to give us a cuddle, but actually wish to eat us, which is probably why we realize that tigers want to eat us in the first place, it has to be said. Or the second example would be that you just get somebody who thinks, actually, I would kind of quite like a cuddle off a tiger. So they stand there waiting for the warm embrace of the tiger and they get their head bitten off. So effectively you have a situation where it might work in the kind of example that Plantinga gives, but it's hard to see how it will pan out on a bigger example. Think of it a bit like lying versus telling the truth. If you never want to be caught out, then tell the truth. Because if you tell the truth, sure, you might get into trouble telling the truth. But one thing is certain is if you tell the truth, nobody will ever find a discrepancy in your account. It will always work through. Whereas if you tell a lie, well, you might get away with it if people don't ask enough questions. Then your lie might seem as cogent as the truth. But if they ask a sufficient number of questions from a sufficient number of angles, then we will be able to discern between the lie and the truth. And I think the same thing applies here. And that brings me on to the second objection, which is, given that fact, we can clearly see that our cognitive faculties are not reliable, despite the argument that Alvin Plantinga furnishes us with, despite the pleas that John Lennox is saying here. You know, if we know that our brains can see truth, we know that our cognitive faculties are reliable. This must require God. We don't know that our cognitive faculties are reliable. In fact, we know that our cognitive faculties are not reliable and we do not accurately perceive the world around us. On a simplistic level, if I walk in from a very, very cold environment and I'm really cold to the core and I plunge my hand into a bucket of lukewarm water, I will erroneously believe that that water is scalding hot. We know how susceptible we are to optical illusions, very, very susceptible to things like that. Our minds are very, very easily fooled. But for me, the big one, and the one that I want to major on here, is perhaps a more fundamental understanding. If your position as John Lennox is that God has given us, if we have this ability to comprehend and to intuitively understand the universe, therefore God, not evolution, well, the problem is that we don't. Effectively, we have a very Newtonian view of the universe. You know, I was very, very lucky, which was that my father started to introduce me to Einstein and special and general relativity from a very, very young age, from about 9 or 10 years old. He was starting to explain to me the ideas that as things move faster, they gain mass. That effectively that we're not moving at a constant rate through time, we're effectively moving at a constant rate through space-time. So that as our velocity in space increases, effectively our velocity in time decreases, time slows down for us. When he told me these things as a 9 or 10-year-old, they were mind-boggling and they were not intuitive. I'm now a 45-year-old, and I've been interested in those things for over 30 years. They are still mind-boggling, and they are still not intuitive. I still have a brain that runs on Newtonian lines, not on Einsteinian relativistic lines, as do you, and as does everybody who will be watching this video, and as does John Lennox. So I've got to ask the question, right, if what he is saying is true, why is this so counterintuitive to us? Why is this actual, accurate understanding of the universe counterintuitive to us if what John Lennox is suggesting is true, is that these cognitive faculties are God-given and that only God can give us cognitive faculties to be able to accurately, intuitively understand the universe? In fact, our brains run along Newtonian lines, along the lines of Newtonian approximations, and of course we know that those approximations are incredibly accurate to the relativistic reality at the low speeds in which our lives actually take place. So we can actually absolutely understand why evolution would gift us that understanding, but from John Lennox's perspective it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. His argument falls absolutely flat on its face on one fact alone. The very thing that he says it's going to do, it fails to do. Okay, well that ends this chapter of my response to John Lennox. Hope you've enjoyed it. Look forward to the next one. Bye for now.